William's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed his twin brother Christopher standing behind him, grinning with teeth filed to points. Though Christopher had died 3 years ago in the car accident, the mirror's surface rippled like water as Christopher's reflection pressed its palms against the glass from the other side, leaving bloody handprints that dripped upward toward the ceiling. The reflection's mouth moved silently, forming words that William couldn't hear, but somehow understood. "You shouldn't have come here alone." Behind him, the bathroom door slammed shut on its own, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that his breath came out in white puffs. The overhead light fixture began swinging in wide arcs despite the complete absence of any breeze, casting wild shadows that danced across the walls like living creatures. Every shadow seemed to have too many limbs, reaching toward him with elongated fingers that stretched beyond what the actual objects should have cast. William had booked this remote Airbnb in the mountains of Colorado using the last of his savings, fleeing the foreclosure notice that would claim his childhood home in just 5 days. His father's medical bills from the terminal cancer diagnosis had consumed everything, and this cabin represented his final desperate attempt to find the family heirloom his grandfather had supposedly hidden somewhere in these woods. A gold pocket watch worth enough to save the house where 4 generations of his family had lived and died. The mirror's surface suddenly shattered outward, spraying glass fragments that hung suspended in midair like frozen raindrops before they began orbiting around his head in a perfect spiral. Christopher's reflection stepped through the broken mirror frame into the bathroom, his skin pale blue and his eyes completely black, water streaming from his hair and clothes as if he'd just emerged from the lake where he'd drowned. "The doll knows you're here," Christopher whispered, his voice carrying the hollow echo of water in his lungs. "It's been waiting for someone from our bloodline to return." The glass fragments suddenly accelerated, slicing through the air toward William's face. But he ducked and bolted from the bathroom, Christopher's wet footsteps splashing behind him on the dry wooden floors. The cabin's layout had changed completely. The hallway now stretched impossibly long, with dozens of identical doors lining both sides, each one slightly ajar, and revealing glimpses of the same kitchen beyond. Through every doorway, William saw the same horrifying scene. A vintage Chucky doll sitting at a small wooden table, its plastic head slowly turning to track his movement as he ran past each door. The doll's orange hair was matted with what looked like dried blood, and its striped shirt was torn and stained. Most disturbing of all, its eyes followed him with an intelligence that no toy should possess. William chose the door at the very end of the hallway, bursting into the kitchen where the doll sat waiting. The moment he entered, all the other doors slammed shut simultaneously, the sound echoing like gunshots through the cabin. The doll's head completed its rotation with an audible click, and its mouth curved into a smile that revealed tiny pointed teeth. "William," the doll said in a voice that was part child, part something ancient and malevolent. "Your grandfather told me you'd come eventually. He made a promise, you see. A blood debt that passes from father to son." The kitchen's fluorescent lights began flickering rapidly, strobing between harsh white and complete darkness. During each flash of darkness, the doll moved, first sitting, then standing on the table, then perched on the edge closer to William, its movements too quick and unnatural for the eye to follow. "What did my grandfather promise?" William asked, backing against the kitchen counter, his hands searching blindly for anything he could use as a weapon. "His firstborn son's firstborn son," the doll replied, its voice now carrying multiple tones as if several entities spoke through it at once. "Your father cheated death for years with those treatments, but cancer always wins eventually. The debt comes due with you." The kitchen window began bleeding, actual blood seeping through the glass and running down in thick rivulets that pooled on the sill. The blood spelled out words in his grandfather's handwriting. "Forgive me, William. The watch is buried beneath the old oak. Take it and run." Behind the doll, the kitchen cabinets flew open, and every knife, fork, and sharp object began floating in the air, their pointed ends aimed directly at William. The doll laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with a child's giggle, and the floating cutlery started spinning in a deadly carousel around the room. William spotted the basement door behind the doll and made a desperate lunge for it, but the doll leaped through the air with impossible agility, landing on his back like a spider. Its small plastic hands gripped his throat with surprising strength, while its pointed teeth sank into his shoulder through his jacket. Fighting against the doll's supernatural grip, William managed to grab a cast iron skillet from the stove and swung it backward over his shoulder. The impact sent the doll flying across the kitchen, where it hit the wall with a satisfying crack. But instead of falling, it stuck to the wall like a gecko, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, still smiling. "You can't destroy me, William," it hissed. "I'm bound to your bloodline now. Your grandfather's deal ensures that." The basement door burst open on its own, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. From below came the sound of his grandfather's voice, weak but urgent. "William!" The salt circle. Under the oak tree, break the circle and burn the bones. Understanding flooded through him. His grandfather hadn't just hidden a watch. He'd created a binding ritual that trapped something ancient beneath the earth. The doll was just a vessel, a puppet for whatever entity his grandfather had been forced to contain decades ago. The floating knives suddenly shot toward him in a coordinated attack. But William dove for the basement stairs, tumbling down into the darkness as the blades embedded themselves in the wooden doorframe above. The basement was filled with an eerie blue light emanating from symbols carved into the stone walls, symbols that hurt to look at directly. At the center of the basement sat an old steamer trunk, and beside it, his grandfather's ghost stood translucent and flickering like a candle flame. The old man's spirit looked tortured, his face etched with decades of guilt and fear. "I was young and desperate," his grandfather's ghost explained, his voice barely audible. "The thing in the woods promised me prosperity for my family, but it demanded a price. I thought I could contain it, but it's been growing stronger, waiting for fresh blood from our line." Above them, the doll's footsteps echoed across the kitchen floor, followed by a sound like fingernails scraping against wood as it searched for the basement entrance. William opened the trunk and found not just the gold pocket watch, but also a journal filled with his grandfather's handwriting, detailing decades of supernatural encounters and the growing malevolence of the entity he'd accidentally summoned. The journal's final entry was recent. "If William comes looking for the watch, he must complete the binding ritual. Only a blood relative can undo what I've done. The salt circle is beneath the oak tree behind the cabin. Break it at midnight when the barrier is weakest. Burn the bones buried there, and speak the words written on the last page. The doll's voice drifted down from above, now speaking in his grandfather's voice with perfect accuracy. William, come back upstairs. Let's discuss this like family. But William had read enough of the journal to know that the entity could mimic anyone it had encountered. His grandfather's ghost pointed urgently toward a narrow window near the basement ceiling, just large enough for William to squeeze through if he could reach it. Using the trunk as a step, William climbed toward the window while the doll's footsteps grew louder overhead. The window was stuck, painted shut years ago, but desperation gave him strength. He smashed it with his grandfather's pocket watch, cutting his hands on the glass as he pulled himself through into the cold mountain night. The oak tree stood 50 yards behind the cabin, its massive trunk twisted and gnarled with age. At its base, William could see the faint outline of a salt circle, mostly worn away by decades of weather but still visible in the moonlight. His grandfather's ghost materialized beside the tree, pointing at a spot where the earth looked disturbed. "Hurry," the ghost urged. "Midnight is only minutes away, and it's strongest then." William began, digging with his bare hands, the cold mountain soil cutting into his already bleeding palms. 3 feet down, his fingers struck something hard, a wooden box containing human bones that were far too old to be from this century. The bones were wrapped in cloth, covered with the same painful symbols he'd seen in the basement. From the cabin came the sound of shattering glass as the doll broke through windows in its search for him. Its voice carried across the clearing, no longer pretending to be human. "You cannot escape what your bloodline owes. Your grandfather's debt becomes your debt." William struck a match from his grandfather's matchbook, one of the few items he'd grabbed from the trunk. The cloth ignited immediately, burning with an unnatural blue flame that made the symbols glow brightly before they crumbled to ash. The salt circle around the tree began glowing with the same blue light, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The doll burst from the cabin's front door, its movements now completely inhuman as it scuttled on all fours like an insect toward the tree. But as the bones burned, the doll's advance slowed, its plastic features beginning to melt and reform into something even more hideous. Reading from the journal's final page, William spoke the binding words his grandfather had written in Latin, his voice growing stronger with each syllable despite his terror. The salt circle flared with brilliant light, and the entity possessing the doll let out a shriek that shattered every window in the cabin. The doll collapsed into a puddle of melted plastic, and the oppressive supernatural presence that had filled the air suddenly vanished. His grandfather's ghost appeared one final time, looking peaceful for the first time since William had seen him. "It's finished," the old man said, his form already beginning to fade. "Take the watch and go home. Save the house. Live the life I couldn't give your father." William clutched the gold pocket watch as his grandfather's spirit dissolved into points of light that drifted upward into the star-filled sky. The cabin behind him now looked normal, just an ordinary mountain rental with broken windows and a scorched kitchen where he'd fought for his life. He walked back to his car on unsteady legs, knowing he'd never be able to explain what had happened here to anyone who hadn't lived through it. The watch in his pocket was real enough, an antique worth exactly what he needed to pay off the foreclosure. But the cost of obtaining it would haunt him forever. As he drove away from the mountains, William caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that moved independently of their sources, reflections that appeared in windows when no one was there to cast them. The supernatural world had marked him during his confrontation with the entity, leaving him forever sensitive to things that existed just beyond normal human perception. The foreclosure was prevented. His father's house was saved. But William knew he'd never feel completely safe again. Some debts, once acknowledged, could never be fully paid. He'd learned that his family's prosperity had been built on a foundation of supernatural horror, and that knowledge would color every moment of his remaining life. Back in the mountains, where the oak tree stood above the burned bones and broken salt circle, something stirred in the ashes. The entity had been banished, not destroyed, and it remembered William's scent. It would wait, as it had waited before, for another desperate soul to make another foolish bargain. The Airbnb listing would remain active, drawing other visitors to the remote cabin where supernatural forces gathered like moths to flame. But that would be someone else's story, someone else's horror to face in the darkness of a place where family debts were collected by entities that existed beyond human understanding. For William, the nightmare was over, but its echoes would follow him home, manifesting in shadows that moved wrong and mirrors that showed too much. He'd saved his family's house, but lost something far more valuable in the process: his ability to exist in a world where monsters were safely confined to stories and movies. The mountain road stretched ahead of him, leading back to civilization and a life forever changed by the knowledge that some horrors were real and some debts were inherited across generations like curses disguised as family heirlooms. But as William's headlights cut through the darkness, something glinted in the rearview mirror. The melted remains of the Chucky doll sat in his back seat, somehow reformed and whole again, its orange hair pristine and its striped shirt clean. The creature's eyes locked onto his reflection in the mirror. "Did you really think burning bones would destroy something that existed before your grandfather was born?" the doll whispered. "I let you think you won. I needed you to take the watch." William's hands froze on the steering wheel as understanding crashed over him. The pocket watch in his jacket began ticking louder, its rhythm matching his heartbeat exactly. With growing horror, he realized the watch wasn't just an heirloom, it was a tracking device, a supernatural anchor that would lead the entity directly to his family home. "Every person who touches that watch becomes mine," the doll continued, its voice now coming from the radio speakers, the air vents, everywhere at once. "Your father will be first, then your sister Emma, then her children. Your grandfather tried to contain me with one life, but I've waited decades to claim an entire bloodline." William yanked the watch from his pocket, preparing to throw it out the window, but his hand wouldn't obey. The watch had fused to his palm, its gold surface burning into his flesh like a brand. The doll giggled as William's car veered off the mountain road, crashing through the guardrail into the ravine below. As darkness claimed him, William's final thought was of his family, sleeping peacefully in the house he died trying to save, unaware that their salvation carried a curse that would consume them all. The entity had played a game decades in the making, and William had been its unwitting final move. The pocket watch continued ticking in the wreckage, calling its true master home.